Hey everyone. Now, I know I had said that in my last video on trading directional air roll that I had hoped it would be my last one on the subject for a little while. But, the truth is, like your own journey with learning directional air roll, my journey with learning it is never complete. So while I'm still very happy with how that video turned out, I've since rewatched and reflected on some of the things I went over in that video and wanted to add some additional points and clarifications that I've found helpful for myself since making those videos, with the hope that they will help you get even more out of your training as well. So to start off, I want to clarify a little bit on why we use stick rotations and how they work in sync with your directional air roll. Now, I started out teaching directional air roll by introducing full stick spinning / rotations without much explanation beyond feeling it out how it works together with your roll, which I still think is a good, simple way to introduce learning the mechanic, but as I think I say in the video, it's not really the realistic way, at least that I use directional air roll in-game. I'm not like constantly rotating the stick. But instead, I think that method is really just a ways of eventually getting to the realization that whenever you're inputting directional air roll, causing your car to roll in this continuous pattern, your stick inputs are in sync with that pattern. I'm going to slow things down for a second here just to help with demonstrating, but what I really meant is that no matter your orientation, your car is doing the same thing when you input a direction on the stick. Just the real world result is different depending on your perspective of the car. When I'm looking at my car from the perspective of the hood facing me, left and right are clearly moving my car, left and right respectively. And if I'm looking from the opposite, the same thing, the car is doing the same thing. It's still turning left and right depending on the input. If I'm inputting left, it's moving to its left, but from my perspective, we're going right. So, no matter where you're at in your roll, your stick inputs are making your car do the same thing. That's kind of just what I think the takeaway is from starting with rotations. And yes, it is true, while constantly rotating the stick in the same direction of your roll keeps your nose pointing relatively straight like this. That's not really the realistic way I'm using directional air roll in game. I'm not just constantly rotating my stick like this. Instead, I'm usually only rotating long enough to, for the purpose of getting my car to the right orientation so that I can then enter the next proper stick input that is with or without air roll, either an air roll, a directional air roll movement, or, one without directional air roll. Again, with the purpose of getting the movement that I want. I'm kind of always using a rotational pattern somewhat, but I'm not constantly rotating the stick to go straight. Instead I'm, chaining inputs together kind of really quickly in my mind, depending on what the orientation is. So again, I'm rarely just fully rotating the stick in game. I'm more rotating to kind of lock in whatever angle I'm at to then chain to the next input that will get me the movement that I want from there. And so yeah, in effect, the rotation of my stick is more of a means of chaining together your specific directional inputs for fluid movement and adjustments, and less so something that you are going to be constantly doing, as you may have gotten the impression of from my sandbox exercises and how I started off there. So yeah, I wanted to add that clarification in. And when you think about it that way, and to almost try and kind of boil down the point of my first two videos, mastery of your control of your air roll is really a matter of three things. First, understanding the possible directions you have access to given the stick movements and directional air roll patterns. So kind of knowing what each stick movement does, both with air roll or without air roll and with air roll turned on. Then, understanding which way is up, meaning which direction each of those cardinal inputs will point the nose of your car, given your perspective. So you can know, what your car does with each input, when your hood is facing you, but you could be completely lost on how to navigate when it's facing away from you. So, really understanding which way is up, given your perspective of the car, is really going to determine how well you can execute this skill. And after that, it really comes down to inputting directional air roll along with the appropriate stick inputs, while learning to feather and control your boost accordingly whenever your nose is pointing the direction you want to move forward. So, in 3 easy steps, right? Easy is 1, 2, 3. So all the possible directions, which way is up, and then execute. Sounds simple, right? Next, I want to talk about what I'm calling air rolling with purpose. Now, this is a phrase that I've been using as a reminder for myself since making these videos, when I've been finding my control waning at times, which I find is mostly because I'm either over rolling or rolling when I didn't really need to, which ends up overcomplicating what could have been otherwise simple flight path to where I wanted to go. So what I've learned is that you really want to get to a place where you are seamlessly transitioning from directional air roll inputs to non-directional air roll inputs, or vice versa, and use both as needed in the most optimal way as possible to get to where you want to go. So it's not about just constantly holding directional air roll and using that as your default way of traveling through the air, but more so using directional air roll to make the most optimal movements in the air to do what you want to do. For example, I've had a really bad habit of using directional air roll and the tornado spin to take off all the time. I usually like to do that, and I'm not afraid to admit that I used to do that just because I think it looked cooler than just a normal takeoff. But a lot of times it's not really necessary. You can just kind of get up off the ground and take off normally, and then directional air roll from there. But sometimes it is optimal to start air rolling from your takeoff. But again, it's not always optimal. So it's something that you want to consciously think about, and not just have a default way of approaching things. You want to kind of question if it makes sense to start air rolling sooner rather than later. Experiment with that. Experiment in game, with taking off with air rolling immediately off the ground versus normal takeoffs, and you'll find that sometimes one works better than the other. But again, directional air roll adds complexity to your flight. It's somewhat straightforward to at least fly in a direction you want to go without using directional air roll, but as soon as you add directional air roll to the mix, there's a lot more at play. So while it is optimal to sometimes use directional air roll, it also could overcomplicate an otherwise simple path to the ball. So every time you have the opportunity to go up for the ball, you should maybe start to question and analyze whether or not directional air roll would help or hinder whatever you're wanting to do. One last note I want to add on for air rolling with purpose is feathering your directional air roll. So a lot of times in the video, I'm kind of holding directional air roll for a solid amount of time while I'm doing my inputs, but what I'm finding really helpful in my own training is learning to kind of feather the directional inputs, the directional air roll inputs, not as much as I might feather boost, but enough so that I'm just making kind of short, incremental, purposeful adjustments to then kind of orient myself to then make the next adjustment. So, kind of experiment with, switching between, holding directional air roll for, longer periods of time versus just short bursts of feathering the directional air roll input with your stick input. And I find this might actually be easier for some folks to learn than holding directional arrow roll, but I think it's good to kind of practice both methods, as I do think it gives you a little bit more fine control over your movement. And the last thing I want to talk about for today is that I just want to reiterate the importance of your secondary directional arrow roll. Though my first two videos were already jam-packed with information, I do wish I found a way to squeeze a little bit more time for talking about your secondary directional arrow roll, because many folks say you really only have to learn or even bind one of the directional arrow rolls, but I really don't agree with that approach. I'm feeling it really helpful to have secondary, the other directional arrow roll bound to your controller, outside of your primary directional arrow roll. Just again, as a quick way to, roll to the opposite side that you're used to, and getting, basically an easy way to access the weak side of your primary directional arrow roll. And I feel like as you truly start to comprehend what's happening with your stick inputs when using your primary directional arrow roll, the small adjustments you'll want to make using your secondary directional arrow roll end up being relatively easy to tack on, because you're literally just rotating or inputting the exact opposite way on your stick. So we can demonstrate this by just kind of like demonstrating how we would go up for like an angled shot to our directional arrow roll's strong side. So if we are using directional arrow roll left, like I am for my primary, you would generally rotate the stick from down to up through the right side to kind of angle your car really quickly to shoot then to your right side, which is directional arrow roll left's strong side. But again, the same is true, just opposite for your secondary. So if I'm using my secondary directional arrow roll, which is directional arrow roll right on my circle button here, I would just rotate the stick from down to up from the left side to get the same angled shot to then the left side of my car, which is directional arrow right's strong side. And again, as you learn the inputs for your primary, at the same time, apply that knowledge that you're learning for your primary to your secondary, that they're the same but opposite. And you might be able to kind of start seeing how you won't use your secondary directional arrow roll, primarily to fly like you would your primary, but again, you can make just kind of quick adjustments because consciously I do this one way with my primary, I just have to do the opposite way for my secondary. And while I really don't actively practice my secondary adjustments a ton, I do use my secondary a ton in practice, because it ends up being a really natural way to flow between inputs and directions for your car. Like when I jump onto a right wall with my primary directional arrow left, and then jump off with my right, I actually couldn't tell you what I'm doing here with the stick. You can kind of see what I'm doing with the stick, but the movement feels really fluid to me, switching between both directional arrow rolls. And same thing can be applied with the opposite side of the wall, just now switching your directional arrow roll inputs. And this goes with coming off the wall for aerials, and basically every movement that you would use your primary directional arrow roll for, you would just do the opposite with your secondary. And I know I said this in my first two videos, but again, secondary directional arrow roll is really handy for stopping your roll or correcting over-rolling if you roll too far from your angle, from the angle that you actually want. You can use your secondary really quickly to kind of correct your perspective and then get to the orientation that you intended to get to. So yeah, just really make sure you have both directional arrow rolls bound. I think that's really the takeaway here, and to incorporate it into your training in a way that you're still primarily using your primary directional air roll for most of your movements, but just adding in your secondary here and there to see how the two kind of work together. And yeah, that's really all I had for today. I wanted to keep this one shorter than the first two, obviously. But yeah, just had kind of those few, again, clarifications and additional notes and tips to hopefully help get the most out of your training. But again, as I continue to work on this skill, as I continue my own Rocket League progress, I will continue to think about what I discover in my own journey, and make additional videos as needed. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about what I showed in my first two videos, or this video, or just on air rolling in general, I'm always available in the comments. Or if you have any specific ideas for like video topics or things you want me to go through in future videos, yeah, let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, thanks for watching as always, and we'll catch you in the next one.